sorrow and suffering in this world, the apparent confusion, everything seems to be out of order in so many ways. For me, very depressing to read the newspaper, to be honest with you, when I see what's going on. It's very difficult for me to see and imagine the combined uncertainty and sorrow and affliction and adversity in this world. It's very important for me to embrace a perspective on history that tells me that God is going to move us in a direction where all will be well. It's very important for me to see the idea of the sovereignty of God. It's a very critical doctrine for us to establish and embrace. We talked about it before when we spoke about the theme in the book of Daniel. And if you go back to Daniel chapter 2 just for a moment with me, you see this theme being clearly developed. In Daniel 2, after the secret of Nebuchadnezzar's dream is revealed to him, verse 20 says, "Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings, and he establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding." The fact is that he removes kings, he establishes kings, he is an authority, he's sovereign. Nothing comes to him as a surprise. There is no surprise for God. He sees all things and rules all things. And this perspective that we see from the Scriptures invites us to see that God is in fact the Lord. In fact, the theme of the book of Job, you might well point out, is really not so much the issue of suffering. The point of the book of Job is the sovereignty of God. And Job wrestles with God over this very issue. You see, unlike you and me, when you and I read the book of Job, what do we get to read? We get to read the first 2 chapters, don't we? And when we read the first 2 chapters, Job didn't have access to those, you see, and he didn't have that perspective that we have. In other words, we can see what God's doing, and we can see that there is this cosmic battle going on, and there is this adversity that occurs, but that it's not pointless, it's not absurd, that there is in fact a testimony, a witness that will bear witness to the authority and the claims of the living God. We don't know. Job didn't know about this matter of the days when the sons of God came and presented, and then Satan claimed that if God strikes Job's family and strikes his possessions, then he will stop serving him. Or furthermore, that if he strikes his body, he will no longer serve you, but he'll curse you. And that concept, that theme, is something that then runs through the book of Job as his counselors, his friends, and they are his friends. They come from a long distance, and they commiserate him for a full week before they say anything. The unfortunate part is when they begin to say things. That's when the problem occurs. And you have, in the structure of the book, after the prologue to the book, you have 3 rounds of debate. There are actual 3 cycles where each of the 3 counselors makes a statement. Job rebuts that statement, and then the next one, and the next one, and so forth. What's happening in those 3 cycles in the book of Job is that the heat continues to grow and the light diminishes as time goes by. They get more and more adamant in their position, which turns out to be a very superficial analysis of why Job might be suffering. Job, on the other hand, becomes increasingly self-defensive, and after a while, a bit self-righteous. And so we have this theme. What's fascinating to me about this book is that people don't change. Circumstances do, but the human nature does not. And the very same kinds of answers that Job received from his friends, those kinds of speculations that he heard, are the kinds of things that are being said even today. It's significant, and that Job has a good deal more depth. The book of Job has a great deal more depth concerning the problem of evil and concerning the issue of God's suffering than we would have in most literature in the history of the world, in fact. Yes?
How do you reconcile or embrace God's sovereignty without becoming a defeatist and basically somewhat just falling into passive resignation.
Yeah.
Just had to ask.
You just had to ask. Well, he's asking the time-old question about God's sovereignty and human responsibility. Because that's the other side of the coin. And the fact is, and I was going to say this, Robert, but that's all right. But I'll say it now. That these are two truths in Scripture that need to be affirmed, even though we cannot put them together fully. There are mysteries in Scripture that I cannot fully embrace. There are tensions that I need to understand. And that tension is that this is not kismet, it's not fatalism, it's not determinism. Yet on the other hand, the Scriptures affirm very, very clearly, texts, for example, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord, that He frustrates the plans of the peoples and so forth, that God is behind all things and sovereign. So how do you reconcile those two things? It's a deep tension. The very first book I wrote, called God I Don't Understand, which is now back in print, discusses 10 of these mysteries in Scripture. This is only one out of 10 that I've identified. And the only solution I could arrive at was to embrace the tension and to recognize that God's mind, if this is truly a revelation from Him, will transcend the ceiling of my own comprehension.
There's examples in nature of that.
Examples in nature. If you think about the whole idea of light itself, and when you think about the understanding that light is really they're particles. The photons are particles, but they're also waves, and there's really not a clear way of grasping what that's all about. There are deep and profound mysteries in nature, even, for example, concerning how the genetic material, how the actual material in the DNA can express itself and form various things. And there's much mystery about information and about all kinds of things in the natural world. That, in fact, the more we learn about it, the more mysterious it becomes, not the less. Anything you study in nature, you could choose anything arbitrarily in the natural order. Not something we've made, but anything that God has made, anything that's in the natural world. Whether it's a leaf or an insect, doesn't matter how small it is, doesn't matter if it's just a blade of grass, it contains mystery. The mystery of life itself we haven't been able to resolve. We don't really clearly grasp how it is that inanimate matter can organize itself, and suddenly this new thing that transcends the material itself becomes life, and so forth. So if we see this true in the natural world, how will we understand in the spiritual world? To paraphrase Jesus with Nicodemus, the idea then is that we should expect this. Now, the analogy I often use, and I'm sure I must have used it here, is the analogy of a man and his dog. If we have animals, we choose our pets because they have at least rudimentary personalities. You see, some people would debate this when it comes to cats, but really, no, they... they have no cortex. Yeah, personality. But at least they have the illusion of personality. But let's be honest about it. When you think about animals like dogs and cats, they surely do have wills, do they not? Very clearly, they have wills. They certainly have emotions. When your dog comes up to you, you can tell that the dog is happy to be with you and so forth. And they certainly can express sorrow, too. Bad dog, the thing with the tail between its legs and woo. I mean, it's so obvious that they have emotions, and they certainly have minds. They know what you're doing when you're eating. In fact, they want in on the action. You see? They can relate to what you're doing. They can grasp that. But there are boundaries. Now, the reason why we choose animals like this is because, after all, we can relate to them. Now, some people go too far. He's just a little person. I remember one person talking about this hideous dog she had. And it was really an ugly dog. And he's just a little person. She saw him as just a member of the family and so forth. I think that's, an ugly little person. So that's called anthropomorphizing. You don't want to do that. You can go too far. It's not a human. But at the same time, it is a person in a very distinct way. It has a soul, but not a spirit as I see it. But having said that, That's why we don't have slugs and roaches as pets, you see, because you really can't relate to them. Imagine you speak for yourself. Suppose, I guess some people do have strange